A pleasant day to you, icons and lady icons. So welcome to our very last discussion in this subject, and this discussion we're actually going to focus on the topic that is related to forensics and death. So at this point, I'm going to give you a short disclaimer that many of the images that are actually present in this discussion are very graphic and very explicit. If you are not okay with those type of images, please do not watch this video presentation, rather just listen to it for you to know the different discussions and gist of the different concepts that is related to the very last part of our discussion. But if you would like to watch this video presentation and continue watching this, trigger warning for every single one of you. Okay, and I'm going to place on the description box the different sources that I had when it comes to the different images that is actually present on this video presentation. Let's simply consider here the concept of forensics or forensic science. The field of forensic science draws from a number of scientific branches, with its focus being on the recognition, identification, and evaluation of physical evidences. So whenever we're actually talking about forensic science, it doesn't always consider the discussion regarding the presence of a dead body or the presence of blood and a carcass or a cadaver. Nope. Whenever we are actually talking about forensic science, it is all about the presence of the physical evidences that will be used on a certain type of trial. Okay? So in the case of forensic science, it doesn't only involve the demise or mortality of a certain type of person, but it actually encompasses the different fields that is related to crime scene investigation to help solve a certain type of crime. So forensic scientists are not only present when there is a dead body, but whenever there are different types of evidences, forensic scientists will be present on the scene. And in the Philippines, there are actually very few forensic scientists, but one of the most well-known forensic scientists that we have in this country is Dr. Raquel Fortune, which is one of the leading forensic scientists, one of the very few forensic scientists in our country. Now, when it comes to the concept of forensic science, it helps to prove the existence of a crime, know the perpetrator of a crime, or a connection to a crime through the following factors. The first one, examination of physical evidence. The second one, administration of tests, interpretation of data, clear and concise reporting, and the fifth one, truthful testimony of a forensic scientist. So in the case of solving any types of crime, for us to know if there is really a crime that happened, there should be a victim and a perpetrator. In the case of the forensic science, it is actually helping to know who is the proper perpetrator, in which it can actually help not only the victim but also the probable suspect. Because remember, we can always accuse anyone of a certain type of crime, but for that person to be properly put into jail or to be sentenced properly, we should determine different factors, just like the connection of those different types of physical evidences. So whenever we're actually going to consider here the different terminologies that is related to crime scene investigation, please remember that we are just going to scratch the surface of the concept of forensic science in this particular discussion. We are not going to have a deeper discussion regarding that matter, since this is just an introduction to those different things, which is simply a proper way to cap off this subject with the concept of death. Okay? So, now, we have here 5 major factors that we should consider when it comes to forensic science for us to determine the connection of a crime of someone. The first one is the presence of physical evidence. So whenever we are actually talking about the presence of physical evidence, always remember here that if ever any crime scene will happen and there are pieces of evidences, specifically physical evidence, that place you on that location of the crime, there's a possibility that you will be considered as a suspect. Okay? You will be considered as a suspect since there are physical evidences against you. One of the first things that will actually give an idea who are the different suspects and will delimit the different choices of among those suspects is considered to be the true perpetrator is by means of the physical evidence. If there is a physical evidence that place you on the location of the crime, there's a possibility that you will be considered as one of the primary or even secondary suspects of this certain type of crime, either homicide, murder, or even burglary. Okay, remember, forensic science is not only about the presence of a dead body. Then the second one, the administration of tests. If you're actually aware of the paraffin test, that paraffin test, it is actually the test that utilizes a certain type of wax, and that wax will be placed on the hands of a suspect to know if that suspect or of that individual fired a gun, because the paraffin will actually pick up the different residue of the gunpowder on the hand. Then that certain type of test is actually being accomplished by forensic scientists. Okay? But not only forensic scientists, even the medical legal, if you're actually aware of those terminologies, the medical legal, they are now related with the Philippine National Police. But there are still different independent investigation bodies that can actually observe what will simply happen or what simply happened on that certain type of crime. Okay? Even DNA testing is being done when it comes to this particular type of test. Okay, to know if there's a relationship between the physical evidence with you as a suspect. And the next one, we have the presence of the interpretation of data. Obviously, after the administration of test, the forensic scientist will now interpret the different data that is actually present and now identify who are actually the possible suspects and who should be removed from the list of the different suspects for us to know who is the true perpetrator of that crime. Then the next one, clear and concise reporting. When it comes to the report of a forensic scientist, it doesn't actually involve here very hyperbolic terms. It doesn't include different types of idiomatic expression because it should always be concise, technical, and clear. Since in this particular case, if you're actually aware of the Desernes case, in which that case is simply sensationalized because of the presence of too much factors. But for us to consider the autopsy result or for us to consider the correct report that simply happened on that certain type of body, all those things that will be observed on the body of any victim should be reported properly. Okay? From the fingerprints to the presence of the DNA, to the mass of that body before and after removing the vital organs, what is the size of the heart, what is the size of the brain, what are the different conditions, even toxicology result, or what is simply observed on the blood of that victim. Okay? And lastly, truthful testimony of a forensic scientist. Well, if you're going to consider this particular part, we actually need more forensic scientists in the Philippines because I won't be very opinionated when it comes to this particular matter, but I would like to say this to every single one of you that we need a lot of forensic scientists in the Philippines, especially with what is happening with our country nowadays. We need more independent bodies to know and to catch the real perpetrators of a crime. All of these things can be observed whenever we are talking about crime scene investigation. Now, there is actually a field that is related to forensic science known as forensic anthropology that focuses on the body of an individual. When it comes to forensic anthropology, it is actually a special subfield of physical anthropology or simply the study of human remains that involves applying skeletal analysis and techniques in anthropology, in archaeology, to solving criminal cases. Now, in the case of forensic anthropology, we can actually see different types of evidences simply by means of looking on the bones of a certain type of individual. On your module, it actually states here the concept of the antemortem, or it simply happened, or the injury that happened before death. Perimortem happened near the time of death, or probably the cause of death. And lastly, postmortem, which happened after death. Now, whenever we actually considering here the skeletal remains and skeletal analysis, there is actually a lot of things that we can see on the bone of a person. Specifically, we can determine what is the type of weapon that is utilized, since that material can actually scrape the bone and create here different types of impressions. So for instance, you fracture the one of your bones, okay? Your bones will heal, but there are different marks that will be left on your bones. Those marks would be present on your bones until you die. And when it comes to the observation probably of a murder weapon, the reason why forensic scientists can actually determine the weapon used when it comes to homicide or murder is because of the imprint that is placed on any parts of their body, specifically on any parts that there is a bone. Because in not all cases, there will be muscles, there would be skin present on a remain. Please take note, we are using the term cadaver for humans, while in the case of animals, we are actually using carcass. Okay, while corpse, that is now the general term. And basically, whenever we're actually talking about corpses, the term corpse is usually used to bodies that are actually embalmed or processed and already buried. Okay, so those are actually the different terminologies that we are using. Carcass, it is usually used for animals. For humans, we are using cadaver. Then for buried bodies, we are now using the term corpse. Okay, so if ever there would be different injuries that would be present on a bone and there is no sign of healing, there's a possibility that that imprint that is present on that bone happened peri-mortem, or near the time of death, or during the time of death, or it happened after death. And now at this point, I am giving you trigger warning since we are going to talk about the death proper. Now, whenever we're actually talking about death, death is permanent, irreversible termination of all biological functions that sustain a living organism. So basically, it is the permanent cessation of all biological functions that is present on an individual. In clinical terms, it is now the cessation or the stoppage of circulation, and for centuries, it is considered as a point of no return. It has always been proven and still provides practical and valid criterion that this event is actually irreversible. Now, when it comes to the concept of death, we are actually going to talk about what will simply happen to the body of a person after he died. Or basically, we are going to talk about here the different changes that will happen to a body post-mortem or after death. Okay? So basically, we have here 6 major things that is actually happening on the body of an individual after his or her demise. The first one, we have pallor mortis or paleness of death. The second one, we have algor mortis or coolness of death. The third one is livor mortis, or also known as hypostasis. Rigor mortis, also known as stiffness of death. Decomposition, which is divided into different substages. And lastly, skeletonization. Trigger warning once again for the next part. Let's simply talk about pallor mortis. Pallor mortis, it is known as the paleness of death since due to the stoppage of the circulation, the body of a person that died will be pale. Or basically, if you're going to use the vernacular, namumutla. It is the very first sign that occurs very rapidly, and it is accomplished within 15 to 30 minutes of death. So basically, whenever we're actually talking about the paleness of death, it simply happened because the circulation that is present on our blood vessels simply stopped because our heart and vital organs stopped functioning. That is the reason why a person who just died became namumutla. After Pallor Mortis, there is now the event known as Takenor. Takenor, it is known as the black spot across the sclera or across the eye of someone that died. Basically, if that person died while its eyes were closed, you're actually going to observe here the presence of a black spot, a black line that signifies here the stoppage of the circulation of blood. It is visible after 7 to 8 hours of death. Now, this is actually a question. Do bodies normally closes their eyes when they die? Well, the answer for this is yes and no. Partially, if someone died while their eyes were open, the lid of their eyes will actually somewhat fall but not completely close. Okay? They are not open, they are not shut completely, but it is intermediate. That is actually evident when it comes to people who just met their demise. Now, after the very first stage of death, we now have here Algor Mortis. Algor Mortis is also known as the coolness of death, or it is now the natural cooling of the body post-mortem to match the temperature present in its surrounding, which remains are found. Whenever an individual dies, since all of its blood circulation is simply cut off or it's simply stopped, what will simply happen to the body of an individual is due to the law of thermodynamics, that the energy that is actually present on the body of an individual will match the temperature that is present in its surrounding. So basically, the body of a person will gradually cool after his death. Okay? So the normal temperature of the body is roughly around 36.5 to 36.9 degrees Celsius. But after the first hour of death, its temperature will drop to 2 degrees Celsius. That would be the case when it comes to the tropics. So basically, the temperature of that person will drop to 2 degrees Celsius during the first hour of death. But for the next hour or succeeding hours, it will now be 1 degree Celsius. That is the average rate when it comes to the coolness of a body whenever that person died. Okay, simply to match the environment. If you're actually going to consider the temperature that is present in the surroundings here in the Philippines, it actually ranges from normally 18 degrees Celsius to approximately 32 degrees Celsius. Those temperatures are actually considered as the average temperatures that is actually present on the different parts of our country. Whenever we're talking about a certain type of phenomenon, it can actually determine the time of death of an individual based on its temperature. Since we are actually talking about here the body temperature of a person who simply died, those factors will be noted since we need to take note of the different things that is actually present on that investigation location. So after Algor Mortis, the third stage of death, it is now known as Livor Mortis. Livor Mortis is also known as hypostasis, or it is now the discoloration of the body due to blood settling. Okay? When the heart stops beating, the blood is now at the mercy of gravity. Okay? And it tends to collect at the dependent part of the body. Or basically, it is being pulled down on the lowest portion of the body of a person. So let's simply consider this cadaver as an example for this. We can actually observe here that the cadaver is lying on its back and the paleness is actually present on the upper portion of this body, on the upper portion of the body, or this is known as the ventral side, while this is now known as the dorsal side of the body. On the back of the body, we can observe here that there are now discoloration in which this is actually the blood that is settling or that is now already present on the lower portion of the body. So this is now the lowest portion of the body that's nearest to the ground. So basically, if someone died while lying on the bed, the blood will actually settle on the back or the dorsal side of the body. But if it is now on a supine position or nakadapa yung katawan when it is observed, obviously the blood would pull down on the ventral side, okay, in front of the body. So trigger warning, if a body was observed hanging or basically nagbigte yung victim, the blood would actually pull down to its feet since the feet is the lowest portion of the body when that demise happened. Okay? Other than the presence of the algor mortis, we could also consider here the liver mortis as another way to determine how or what happened to a certain type of victim. Okay, so another example. There is actually one of the most common examples when it comes to the utilization of liver mortis when it comes to the different evidences when it comes to the death of an individual. In this particular case, there is now the presence of a ligature mark, or this is now the mark that is being left by strangulation. Okay, so obviously we can observe here that a certain type of very long, flexible material was utilized to strangle this victim. Okay? And the ligature mark would actually be present here. Okay? A mark would simply be left by the suspect by means of utilizing the different materials that are actually present probably on the crime scene. We can now determine who is the perpetrator or who is the culprit of this crime. Okay? This some of the examples also in this particular case. We can now observe here cyanosis. Okay, when it comes to cyanosis, obviously it is happening when the body is no longer receiving enough oxygen. Okay, cyanosis or the blue hue that is happening when it comes to the body of an individual that died is because of the lack of oxygen. So in this particular case, there's also another case of strangulation by hand. And also, trigger warning once again, it could actually be available or evident even on accident among kids. So in this particular case, we can observe here a still blue cyanosis of the lips of this child, which strangled himself accidentally. And you can observe the ligature mark present on the neck of this child. Okay? So those are actually the different marks that can be left whenever we are talking about livor mortis. Now, the next stage of death, it is now rigor mortis, or also known as stiffness of death. So after death, respiration stops. Basically, cellular respiration. So no more ATP is produced. Therefore, the muscles freeze in the position they are in. So basically, whenever we are talking about the rigor mortis, it is because of the different muscle fibers that are present on our body. Basically, the actin and myosin. Okay? The actin and myosin, they're actually two types of fibers that are sliding past each other whenever we are actually doing different movements. So, if the body stayed contracted, okay, they would be stiff. And once a person died, that is actually the response of the body, that is to simply utilize the remaining calcium that is present in our muscles, and those calciums will actually bind on the actin and the myosin fiber, creating now stiffness. This process actually starts within 2 to 8 hours after death. Okay? And rigor mortis will stop once the muscle fibers that are actually present on that individual starts to decompose, roughly around after 72 hours. Okay? So, the reason why the body of an individual who died stiffens after a few hours of its death is because of the different muscle fibers that are just utilizing the remaining energy that is present in every single one of them. Okay? Since homeostasis cannot be accomplished by the body, with the process of the thermodynamics, it will just utilize all the remaining materials present until they met their decomposition or demise. Okay, so basically those are the things that is happening when it comes to rigor mortis. So as you can observe here, the stiffening of a cadaver when it comes to the autopsy table, and also in this another case, stiffness when it comes to their death. They will stay in that position until their muscles start to decompose. After rigor mortis, let's now talk about decomposition. So another trigger warning for everyone. Decomposition, it is now known as the process of rotting and the decay of an individual. So it is now the moment when the remains start to decompose, and they simply rot and decay due to the changes in the chemical composition of the body as well as the action of various organisms. It could be accomplished by micro or macro organisms. So as you can observe here, this is now a decomposing man covered with maggots, covered with flies larvae that will enter the different orifices of the body, from the eye socket to the nose to the mouth to the ear to the nasal cavity to the oral, even to the anus, and even to your genitals. These organisms may enter, and disclaimer, even the bacteria that is already present in our gut will start eating our body from inside out. So basically, when it comes to the process of decomposition, there is actually two main processes that is happening during this particular phase. We have here the presence of autolysis, or it is now the time when the body's own enzyme begin to break down cellular proteins, or we already discussed this on the previous discussions that when it comes to autolysis, it is now the time in which the cells will gradually die. Okay? Autolysis, it is also related with apoptosis. Okay? Then also there is now the presence of putrefaction, that is the decomposition driven by bacterial activity and the release of gases. Now, in the case of decomposition, it is actually divided into four major stages. And there are actually different type of scent and smell that is being released by a decomposing body. Okay, let's simply talk about the different stages before we talk about the cause of those odor or scent that we can smell when a body, not only a cadaver but also even a carcass, dies. The different stages of decomposition are the following. The first one, the fresh stage of decomposition, then the bloated stage, then the active decay, then the advanced decay. All of which are actually releasing different types of odors, just like the presence of cadaverine, or in the case of cadaverine, it is now foul and rotting flesh. While in the case of the second one, we have the putrescine. The putrescine is now the presence of putrefied flesh, or it is now the scent of garbage. Or I'm going to use layman's term here, yung maasim-asim na parang suka. Okay? That is actually the scent of putrescine. That is also the scent of indole. Okay? Ang pinagkaiba ng putrescine at ng indole, when it comes to putrescine, you can actually distinguish here na parang basura talaga ito. While in the case of indole, it's now pungent, musty, and at the same time stale or sobrang masangsang. Okay? Na sobrang asim na basically para kang umamoy ng suka. Trigger warning once again. Then, we also have here the odor known as skatol. While in the case of katol, it is now the strong fecal odor, or the scent of feces, the scent of fecal matter. Okay? If cadaverine is the scent of the rotting smell, katol, it is now the scent of fecal matter, that grainy scent, which is vomit-inducing when it comes to the presence of a decaying body. Since we are talking about somewhat appetizing things, let's now consider here the following stages of decomposition. Trigger warning once again. The first one, we have here the presence of the fresh decomposition. Okay, so we have here on the left side of our screen, it is now the presence of the fresh decomposition. In the case of fresh decomposition, it is now the process that is simultaneously happening with the four phenomenon. Okay, we can observe here some bruising, we can now observe here some discoloration, and that is now actually the time in which the different cells and the different tissues of the body is now starting to decompose and change its structures, okay? And there is now visible necrosis. So whenever we're actually talking about necrosis, it is now the start of decay. Other than the ones that are actually present here, we can also observe here on the right side that this is also considered as fresh decomposition, since there is still the presence of discoloration and there is now the start of the bloating process. Okay? Now, after the fresh decomposition, we now have here the process of bloated state. If on the previous slide, this is semi-bloated since there is now the start of the presence of gases. On the next part, this is now the time in which the body is already bloated, that the different muscles and the different cells are now actually possessing here different coloration, and they are now possessing here different types of juices. And you can observe that the stomach already enlarged. It is because of the microbial community that's residing on our gut. Not only the gut of this organism, but also even the gut of us humans, which are still alive. We are possessing this gut microfauna, which is responsible for helping us when it comes to the different food materials that we are consuming. But once we died, they will now take in charge of the different things that will happen to our body and result to the presence of bloating. The reason why bloating happens, it is because of the release of the gases that is present when it comes to this bacteria while they are consuming our cells, dying tissues, decomposing entrails. Okay, so they are not taking in charge. Which also leads us to the next part, which is known as the active decay. We can also observe here that the active decay is actually happening when it comes to this particular part, since it is now showing infestations of the different organisms that are actually present within our body and the exterior. So if we're going back to the very first part of this slide when it comes to the decomposition, once maggots, botflies, and even other types of critters already start to ingest the decomposing part of our body, the decomposing part of that body or of that carcass, active decay is happening. Okay? Active decay is actually the longest process of decomposition, since it is now the time in which different organisms are feasting on our entrails. And whether you like it or not, if you won't be cremated, active decay will happen 6 feet under. After this very appetizing imagery, let's now proceed to the last part, which is now known as the advanced decay. When it comes to the advanced decay, it is now when the decomposition is largely inhibited. And this is now the time in which the only available cadaveric materials are the bones, some keratin fibers, skin, hair, and nails. Okay, in the case of advanced decay, the muscles and the fats are already consumed by different microorganisms and even macroorganisms. When it comes to advanced decay, insect activity already decreased. Okay? And at the same time, there is now the presence of metamorphosis of other organisms. For instance, the larvae of a fly already became the adult fly. And at the same time, whenever we are considering these remains, when whenever they are actually located on a certain type of vegetation or on land, the perimeter where the body is located shows signs of vegetation death due to the spike of the amount of nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, and magnesium, which are actually the byproduct of the process of decomposition. Because of the presence of those too much elements, the vegetation dies. Then, when it comes to the concept of decomposition, there is actually a law that we are following here, and that is known as the Casper's law. According to the Casper's law, a body will take twice the time to decompose in water, but the body of an individual will decompose faster on fresh water, not on salt water. Okay? If we're going to consider now only the solution that is present there, it will be faster on the fresh water because that is an example of a hypotonic solution. While hypertonic solution, that is now in the case of the salt water. Okay, if you're going to consider those terms. Then, according also to Casper's law, when it comes to that body decomposition, it will take twice time to decompose in water than it would on air, and 8 times longer if it is underground. So basically, if you're actually going to consider those things, there is a lot of factor to consider when it comes to the death of an individual. And that is actually why I am encouraging every single one of you, for those who want to pursue the medical field, to consider forensic anthropology, to consider forensic science, since our country is needing more, it's needing a lot of forensic scientists. And in my case, if only I have the time, if only I have the resources to have the degree in forensic science, I would definitely grab that opportunity. I would grab the chance to be a forensic scientist. Because why not? They can actually help the justice system here in the Philippines by means of being more scientific when it comes to those particular matter. And lastly, the last stage of decomposition, it is now the skeletonization. In the case of skeletonization, it is now the complete decomposition of soft tissues and the complete exposure of the skeleton. Or the skeleton is now known as the non-cadaveric material. They cannot decompose yet because they cannot be consumed by these organisms. Okay? Other than the bones, you also have the presence of the leathered skin. There's also the presence of the leathered skin or very dried skin. Then the presence of teeth, hair. Anything that cannot be consumed by those organisms. And this is now the end of my discussion, not only for this module but for this subject. Once again, maraming salamat and haynayan magpakailanman. Paalam.